Records show that long before the name became globally known, there were warnings that did not travel far, complaints that did not reach the right desks, and voices that were documented but not amplified. According to court filings and investigative reports, the pattern began quietly, with individual accounts that were easy to dismiss in isolation. Each report appeared small on its own, separated by time, geography, and circumstance. Taken together, they formed a picture that only later would be recognized as systemic neglect. Documents indicate that some of the earliest allegations were treated as local matters, not signals of something broader. Police notes, according to records, described young complainants whose credibility was questioned almost immediately. Their accounts were often framed as misunderstandings, exaggerations, or issues beyond jurisdiction. In several cases, investigators noted inconsistencies not uncommon in trauma narratives, yet these inconsistencies were used to justify inaction rather than deeper inquiry. Reports suggest that when complaints reached higher levels, they encountered layers of professional caution. Prosecutors weighed the perceived strength of testimony against the social standing of the accused. Internal memos, later reviewed by journalists, indicate concern over resources, trial risks, and reputational consequences. The question of whether victims would be believed was raised early and repeatedly, but rarely answered in their favor. According to records, some victims attempted to return with additional information. They named locations, dates, and intermediaries. They described patterns rather than isolated incidents. Still, files were closed, reopened, and closed again. In some jurisdictions, law enforcement agencies communicated with one another, but the exchanges remained limited. Information was shared cautiously, sometimes verbally, sometimes without follow-up. Documents indicate that civil complaints were also met with resistance. Attorneys representing victims encountered delays, sealed motions, and private negotiations. Settlements, where they occurred, often included confidentiality provisions. Reports suggest that these agreements, while providing compensation, also ensured silence. The public record remained thin, fragmented, and incomplete. According to investigative journalism, the social environment surrounding the accused played a significant role. Wealth and influence created buffers that altered how institutions responded. Meetings took place behind closed doors. Decisions were justified as pragmatic rather than moral. The language used in correspondence emphasized risk management, not protection of the vulnerable. As years passed, according to records, some victims aged out of the categories that initially defined their complaints. Their stories lost urgency in official eyes. Statutes of limitation became barriers rather than safeguards. Files gathered dust while the individuals named in them continued their lives largely uninterrupted. Reports indicate that journalists who later reviewed these cases were struck by what was missing. There were few aggressive follow-ups, few attempts to reconcile multiple accounts, and little evidence of sustained investigation. The silence was not total, but it was sufficient. It allowed patterns to remain patterns rather than proof. According to court transcripts, when a major case finally moved forward, it did so with significant limitations. Charges were narrower than the scope suggested by earlier complaints. Some alleged victims were not included. Others were informed after decisions had already been made. The process, while legal, appeared to many as incomplete. Documents indicate that non-prosecution agreements and plea negotiations became central turning points. These agreements, according to records, were justified as efficient resolutions, yet reports suggest they had the effect of foreclosing broader accountability. Victims later stated that they were not fully informed or consulted. Their role in the justice process was minimal. According to subsequent reviews, these legal outcomes created confusion and anger among those who had come forward. Some believed their cooperation would lead to exposure of a larger network. Instead, they watched as cases concluded quietly. The system, designed to hear them, seemed to move past them. As time went on, according to reports, more individuals recognized similarities in their experiences. Support networks formed informally. Stories were compared, timelines aligned. What emerged was not a single narrative, but many overlapping ones. Each added detail reinforced the sense that early warnings had been missed or ignored. Documents indicate that when federal authorities later revisited the matter, they relied heavily on records that already existed. The same police reports, the same testimonies, the same unanswered questions resurfaced. The difference was context. What once appeared isolated now appeared connected. According to records, public reaction shifted rapidly once these connections became visible. Media coverage intensified. Politicians called for explanations. Internal reviews were announced. Yet for victims, this attention came late. Years had passed since their first attempts to be heard. Reports suggest that institutional responses focused on procedure rather than accountability. Agencies reviewed whether rules had been followed, not whether justice had been served. Findings often cited discretion, complexity, and legal constraints. Rarely did they address the human cost of delay. According to victim statements, the impact of being ignored extended beyond legal outcomes. Many described long-term effects on trust, mental health, and personal stability. Their experiences with authorities became part of the trauma itself. Being dismissed or doubted left lasting impressions. Documents indicate that some officials later acknowledged missed opportunities. Statements referenced lessons learned and reforms implemented. However, these acknowledgments stopped short of admitting fault in specific decisions. The language remained careful, measured, and distant. As investigative efforts continued, according to reports, questions expanded beyond individual cases. Attention turned to how power influences credibility. Why were certain voices discounted while others carried weight? How did social status shape investigative priorities? These questions remained largely unanswered. According to records, internal communications revealed awareness of reputational risk. Officials discussed potential backlash, media scrutiny, and career implications. The protection of institutions appeared intertwined with the handling of allegations. Victims were rarely central in these discussions. Documents indicate that when new evidence surfaced years later, it often mirrored what had been available before. The difference lay in willingness to act. What had once been set aside was now presented as significant. This shift raised further questions about earlier decisions. According to reports, some victims expressed mixed feelings as cases re-emerged. Validation came alongside frustration. The acknowledgement of harm did not erase years of silence. For many, justice felt partial, delayed, and uncertain. As proceedings unfolded, according to court records, legal arguments emphasized jurisdiction, timing, and evidentiary standards. These technical discussions, while necessary, contrasted sharply with the lived experiences described in affidavits. The gap between law and harm remained visible. Documents indicate that public inquiries examined prosecutorial discretion. Experts debated whether different choices could have been made. Some argued constraints were real. Others suggested caution had crossed into avoidance. No consensus emerged. According to investigative summaries, the broader system was not designed to respond swiftly to allegations involving powerful individuals. Layers of approval, consultation, and review slowed action. Each layer provided justification for delay. Reports suggest that victims often interpreted silence as judgment. When calls were not returned and updates did not arrive, assumptions filled the void. Many concluded their stories were not worth pursuing. This perception discouraged others from coming forward. According to records, advocacy groups later highlighted these dynamics in calls for reform. They emphasized transparency, victim notification, and oversight. Their arguments drew directly from the experiences documented in these cases. Documents indicate that while reforms were discussed, implementation varied. Some jurisdictions adopted new guidelines, others relied on existing frameworks. The uneven response reflected broader systemic challenges. As the narrative continued to unfold publicly, according to reports, attention often shifted to prominent names and sensational details. Victims worried their stories would again be overshadowed. The focus on power sometimes eclipsed the focus on harm. According to statements, many victims sought not only punishment, but acknowledgement. They wanted their early warnings recognized as valid and consequential. The absence of such recognition remained a source of pain. Documents indicate that historical reviews may continue for years. New information may surface, and interpretations may change. Yet the record already shows a consistent theme. When victims spoke, their words entered systems that were slow to listen. According to records, the legacy of these cases is not confined to one individual or one outcome. It raises enduring questions about credibility, power, and silence. How many warnings must accumulate before action becomes unavoidable? How many voices can be discounted before neglect becomes policy? Reports suggest that the answers remain unsettled. The files, once closed, now remain open in public memory. They serve as reminders of what happens when institutions prioritize caution over compassion. According to available evidence, the story is not solely about crimes alleged, but about responses chosen. Each ignored report shaped what followed. Each delay altered outcomes. The cost of inaction was not abstract. It was personal, cumulative, and lasting. Documents indicate that as time passes, opportunities for full accountability narrow. Memories fade, evidence degrades, and legal options diminish. For victims, this erosion reinforces the sense that justice, once deferred, may never fully arrive. According to records, the silence that once protected reputations now invites scrutiny. Questions persist about who knew, when they knew, and why responses unfolded as they did. These questions continue to circulate without definitive answers. Reports suggest that understanding this history requires attention not only to events, but to omissions. What was not done matters as much as what was. The absence of decisive action became part of the narrative. According to survivors' accounts, being ignored was not a single moment, but a process. It unfolded through meetings that went nowhere, letters that received no reply, and promises that dissolved over time. This process shaped lives in ways that cannot be fully measured. Documents indicate that future cases will inevitably be compared to this record. Investigators, prosecutors, and officials will face expectations informed by past failures. Whether those expectations will lead to different outcomes remains uncertain. According to reports, the enduring question is not simply how such neglect occurred, but how it was allowed to persist. The answers lie scattered across files, testimonies, and decisions made in silence. As the record stands, according to available documentation, the story remains unfinished. The voices once ignored now echo through archives and reports. They challenge institutions to confront not only what happened, but what was overlooked. According to records, the cost of ignoring victims extends beyond individual cases. It shapes public trust and defines institutional legitimacy. When warnings are dismissed, the consequences reach far beyond those who first spoke. Reports suggest that this history will continue to be examined, debated, and reassessed. Each review adds context, but also reveals gaps. The full truth may remain elusive, but the pattern of neglect is clear. According to the files, When victims were ignored, silence became an accomplice. Not through action, but through absence. And that absence, documented and undeniable, remains one of the most troubling aspects of the record.